The reason I chose that song was I was thinking about betrayal with our content in Mark chapter 14 and Judas and all the things we've been talking about and what we'll continue to talk about today, betrayal. And I was looking up songs with the word betrayal or betray in them. This one popped up, and thus that dark betrayal night, because we do tend to think of that whole night being characterized by the decision of Judas. But that third verse is interesting. Well, the second verse as well. Let's see. His body given in our stead is seen in this memorial bread, and so our feeble love is fed until he come. We've trained ourselves, I think, to not think about the bread as being something that feeds and sustains us, because, for goodness sake, it's a tiny little piece of bread. It's not really all that sustaining in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense, that's exactly what is sustaining our love. It is feeding our love, our commitment to Christ, that we do this every week. We come together and we recommit ourselves to Christ in the supper as we feed upon the bread. And in that third verse, which is, I don't think in most of the other psalm books, I don't think it's in this one, his fearful unknown agony, his lifeblood shed for us, we see, the wine shall tell the mystery until he comes. So again, just the sort of mysterious nature of Christ and the sacrifice and the betrayal. So anyway, those are some of the things that were on my mind. Mark chapter 14. Did we mention that this is a long chapter? Because it is. We've basically covered down through about verse 42. And verse 42 is sort of the perfect lead-in. We talked a little bit about, the disciples sleeping, Jesus, asking them to watch and pray, coming to them 3 times, his crying out, Abba, Father, sort of a shortened version of the Gethsemane prayer that we have in more full detail in John 17. But it says in verse 42, well, verse 41, he says, returning the 3rd time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So remember we talked about the strengthening and the resolve that Jesus finds in the garden. It's healing for him in a sense. Yes, it was agony and it was difficult, and yet he comes away comforted, he comes away strengthened, and resolved to deal with what he knew was coming. So verse 43, just as he was speaking, almost immediately after he says those words, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Teaching in the temple, the word everyone, deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Lots of theories about how naked he was, but either way, it was a situation of shame where he's running away. And of course, most of the commentators and scholars believe this to be Mark himself, the writer of these words. But he flees in a very particular way that we don't see descriptions of the others who also deserted and fled. So again, these are things we've been continuing to discuss, and I think we need to keep that discussion open as we go along through these verses. The betrayal of Judas and his motivations and his struggles, but also to connect that to, again, the other disciples, and then by extension, the other followers of Jesus, and then by further extension, ourselves, where the application lies. So back to Judas for a little while here. Um, Jesus is betrayed by a close friend, right? He's one of the apostles. He is among those whom Jesus loved. If you look at John 13 and verse 1, um, John's version, he emphasizes that Jesus wants to be with those whom he loved, and Judas is among those. And yet, as prophesied, Jesus was betrayed by him. The prophecy in particular comes from Psalm 41, and that's an interesting psalm. It's a little bit different than most of the psalms. It's almost kind of a vengeance psalm, you might say. Psalm 41 says, "Blessed is he who has regard for the weak. The Lord delivers him in times of trouble. The Lord will protect him and preserve his life. He will bless him in the land and not surrender him to the desire of his foes. The Lord will sustain him on his sick bed and restore him from his bed of illness." So this is someone who has regard for the weak, okay? So God is going to take care of him when he is weak. I said, "O Lord, have mercy on me. Heal me, for I have sinned against you. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish?" Ooh, wow. "Whenever one comes to me, he speaks falsely while his heart gathers slander. Then he goes out and spreads it abroad." This is kind of a complaining psalm, complaining about those who speak badly against him. Verse 7, "All my enemies whisper together against me. They imagine the worst for me, saying, 'A vile disease has beset him. He will never get up from the place where he lies.'" Quite difficult accusations. But in verse 9 in particular, this is the prophecy, or at least what we take as a prophecy of what happened to Jesus. It says, "Even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." Some of your translations may have a betrayal type word there. "But you, O Lord, have mercy on me. Raise me up that I may repay them. I know that you are pleased with me, for my enemy does not triumph over me. In my integrity you uphold me and set me in your presence forever. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Amen and amen," which ends book 1 of the Psalms. But anyway, so the prophecy is contained within an interesting psalm that seems like it's a little bit about vengeance. And yet, of course, we know that vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So it's not so much a glorification of him actually taking vengeance out on these naysayers and enemies per se, but how God takes care of him and would deal with those situations and those enemies. So to some extent, then, that's applicable here with Jesus, in that we know that Jesus doesn't strike back. Jesus does not take vengeance out on Judas. He allows basically the consequences of Judas's own choice to deal with Judas. But a close friend, someone who's no stranger to Jesus in any way, shape, or form. But apparently being close to Jesus is no guarantee that one might never fall away or betray or deny Jesus. When you read through the Revelation churches and you see things about churches who left their first love, and they begin to tolerate false doctrine, and they permit false teachers, and they fail to perfect works, and they're not watchful, becoming lukewarm, those kinds of issues. Being close to Jesus at some point in life does not guarantee that we stay close to Jesus throughout our lives. We can betray him, we can deny him at really any point in time. And so that's why the admonition is there in Revelation 2:10, of being faithful unto death. That faithfulness is a constant process, something that has to be constantly in our attention in order to take place. So we think about Judas. One of the things that we attribute his betrayal to is, and I think we may have talked about this a little bit, the money problem. Okay, I'm talking too much. Let me open it up to you. In what ways do you suppose, money was a problem for Judas? Did I do something funny? I missed it.
At the very beginning, I was wondering the reason why he did what he did, was it money, or did he misunderstand Jesus and feel like Jesus would be able to overcome, this? It would force his hand.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
If he can make money off of it,
Sure.
all the better.
Yeah, mixed motives, for sure, and that's one of the things. In fact, I've got a note about that. Some of the commentators and scholars think maybe Judas did this to give Jesus an opportunity to break out and take control, like Peter tries to do, pulling out the sword and cutting off the guy's ear. It worked on Peter, but it didn't work on Jesus.
And also after the resurrection.
Yeah.
Them saying, "Are you going to now restore?
Are you going to restore the kingdom?" Yeah.
They still didn't understand
Sure.
that he was. Death didn't end it. They thought.
Sure. And that it was not an earthly kingdom. So yes, some mixed motivations here for Judas. So, but money is partially motivating him. Of course, we have the note in John 12 about him sometimes pilfering from the money box of the disciples. That's John 12, verses 4 through 6. The opportunity to make some money out of this may have led him down that path. And again, be a problem for us to a degree where we prioritize it over Jesus in some way, or we allow it to consume us so much in some way that we miss out on opportunities to be closer to Jesus. What do you think? You think, and I'll go to 1 Timothy chapter 6.
I have more sympathy for Judas now as an old lady than I did when I was a youngster. When I was a youngster, it was very black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I'm older and have made lots of mistakes myself, and have not understood things properly, I have pity for him.
Yeah, pity, sympathy, an understanding of the struggle. In verse 6 of 1 Timothy 6, it says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." What an important reminder. "But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap. And some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." So Paul at least attributes some of the wandering away from the faith of people. He attributes that to money, the love, specifically the love of money. So that tends to make us think of the more extreme examples of very, very greedy people who just want bukus and bukus of money and go to great lengths to swindle and be ostentatious and live lavish lives and so forth. And it's important for us to note those examples, but it's not as practical for us from an application standpoint. So what are some ways that we might, on a day-to-day basis, struggle with this?
More on keeping up with our neighbors, like, so to speak, keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah.
Like, keeping up with the societal, like, this is what it looks like if you
Yeah.
are rich.
Yes.
And I think that will turn our hearts.
Sure. And it doesn't even have to be rich, just successful or just do what we need to function as a middle class American family or whatever. I'll use the poster child, and please don't. I'm not criticizing anybody who has cable television, okay? But that used to be in my mind like the thing. If we could get cable television, you must be doing pretty well, Missionary kid, whatever. But, Melanie and I, when we first got married, we got cable television because we were just like, okay, we got to have cable television. She grew up with it. I mean, it was just part of it. And we weren't maybe 6 or 7 months in, and it was just like, man, this is a lot of money. And we don't hardly watch it that much. And it's just, so we're just like, we're going to cut cable. And even at that point, 15 years ago, people were just like, you did what? It's like, yeah, we just went to this streaming thing called Netflix, or well, at that point, it was just the discs coming in the mail, actually. So, saved quite a bit of money. But I just use that as an example. There are much better examples than that you guys can probably think of in your own lives, where it really, in that moment, it wasn't about the money exactly. It was about this status, this level that we need to maintain in order to be respected amongst peers, those kinds of things. So there's another side to this. Now, I'm not suggesting that Judas is worried about cable television, but I'm suggesting that there were some things about society, some things about Judas's day-to-day life that must have motivated him. Who knows what Judas needed in his life, or thought he needed, that this 30 pieces of silver was going to take care of for him. Maybe some debts, maybe a sick aunt or something. He may have had some what he thought were very noble motivations to get a hold of this money. And as Johnny pointed out, the possibility that this might be the thing that pushes Jesus into the forefront, and then he takes his sword up and goes against the Romans and conquers. But there's some, just for us, some day-to-day application on what are the things that I think I need to have in order to really enculturate into my society, and I need money to do that. It's the tool to make that happen. That's really not necessary for us. And I think that might be individual to you. You have a hand. You have two, in fact.
Well, I just know that as Bobby and I were raising our family, this push to work so that your kids, besides cable television, your kids have this and this. And I hear it often with young couples. They say, well, I grew up poor, and I don't want my kids to do without the things I did without. And what they're not understanding is it's things, and things are transient. And as Christians, we ought to understand that better than anybody on earth. And so to say no to being busy, working more hours to get more stuff, instead of saying, I'm content with what we have. Mm-hmm. So it's a contentment thing in my life. And I have to do it to myself now. I have to say, Nancy, you don't need that. You don't need it.
You don't need 500 reams of fabric and so forth.
No, that's different.
Okay.
Bolts, yes.
Bolts. Oh,
Yes.
okay. I'll thank you. Thank you so much for making that clear.
But when they come free to you, that's different, right?
Totally. It's interesting, she brings up a word that was in that passage, but godliness with what? With contentment is great gain. So, yeah. And then in verse 8, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. It's really hard to boil it down to something as simple as that, and yet it is true. If we just have enough food, we have enough clothing, and we're basically protected from the elements, those basic things, that's really, truly all we need. And again, I'm not saying that Jesus says you can't have cable television. I'm not saying that Jesus is telling us to not have fabric or paper. But when those things in some way start to take over or start to prioritize ahead of Jesus in some way or ahead of God in some way, that's where we really have to do some self-examination. And it really is very personal. It is self-examination. Because I can't judge any one person in here for having something that I don't have and saying that's the thing that's getting in the way of Jesus. That's the thing that's getting in the way of your walk with God, because I don't know that. Only you do. Barry, did you have a hand? Up? Or to the side? Go ahead.
I didn't hear that last word.
I was asking, did you have a comment?
Did.
Okay. Yes, please.
We have to ask ourselves along the same lines of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Will I make a trade
Sure.
about what I believe? Is there a line I will not cross?
Uh-huh.
And that leads us, when we say, oh, that's a possibility, or whatever it is, whether it be cable or the likes of another human being.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
know, for to be accepted by a group of people or
Mhm.
an individual, or even in your mind, whatever you think society wants.
Yeah.
And that may be a lie. You may be selling out for a lie. But you have to know, you have to think, where is my line? What
Yeah.
will I sell out for?
Mhm.
And obviously, Judas sets this example for us.
Yes.
That even people that are the closest to Jesus
Yes.
fall prey to worldly things.
Right.
And it's just, it runs the whole gamut. What will I give up
Mhm.
to minimize my faith in Jesus?
Yeah.
Or my, the word I'm trying to look for, I don't know, the glue that holds me to Jesus.
Yeah.
Whatever that word
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
What will I do to give that up?
Sure. What will uh, what will I give in exchange for my soul? You know, that's kind of what Jesus had said earlier, that Judas must have heard.
And it can start in your own family.
Absolutely.
It does my family trump the
Mhm.
saving blood of Jesus? Does my work trump
Yeah.
the saving? Now, there are exchanges and there's considerations
Absolutely.
that you have to make all along the way
Mhm.
about time constraints and availability of energy in your body and just knowledge and life. But if you give that up and cross the line,
Mhm. Mhm.
then you've done what this example shows.
Shows us.
We will fall.
Yeah, and I think the key about what you're saying is the fact that we need to do this beforehand. It's the thinking ahead of time.
And Paul talks about that in some of his work. I couldn't find it, the exact language that says, you know, that if I don't keep beating my body into shape, then I will not
Yeah.
achieve the prize. So there is some, obviously, we go from order to chaos.
Yeah, very quickly.
So if we do not manually
Ah.
dictate staying on the straight and narrow, we will
Yeah. So you're suggesting self-discipline, right?
all the way.
Yeah, self-discipline.
It's not gonna, this universe didn't happen by itself.
Sure.
So we're not gonna fall into sync with it
Without effort.
just by chance.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that he betrays Jesus with a kiss, a sign of affection, right? He shows him affection in this, very culturally appropriate way. He shows him this sort of deference and respect and affection and love at the moment of betrayal, which is so poignant, and Jesus points it out. Jesus notes this very obvious contradiction when he asks him in Luke's version in chapter 22 and verse 48. He asks it, how does he say? It's like the Son of Man. You betray the Son of Man with a kiss, you know?
That's a lie. What he did, he just lied to Jesus by kissing him.
Yeah, right. So a false affection, a show of affection, an emphasis on the word show.
Calling him a rabbi and all this other stuff.
Right.
Which is a title of
A veneration, yeah. So again, the question becomes: are there some ways in which we kind of show God, show Jesus a show of affection, a demonstration of affection, while having our betrayal at hand? Some ways that we don't prioritize, and so it just feeds into what we've been talking about already. But I think it's important, as Barry was saying, for us to think beforehand, what are some ways I have a possibility, a potential to do this in the future? And so I can be extra guarded in those areas. Our emotions are kind of up and down. And so there may be moments where, like Peter in the story, we jump in, Jesus, all the love, and to do all the talk. And we may do some great things in that process, but in the process of doing that, sometimes I think we also maybe betray some of the things that Jesus really wants us to do internally and the kinds of service that he wants us to give to others. Wow. Okay, is that good, huh? Just it's blowing your mind, so it's hard for you to think of anything. I get that.
Think of what?
Ways in which we might do a show of affection towards Jesus. I guess I'll liken it to what Jesus says about the lip service. But their hearts are far from me. We honor him with our lips, but our hearts are far from us.
Treat others with as high as esteem as their due.
Yeah.
Being the creation of God, maybe we minimize their actions or faults in their daily life so that we look better or appear better.
Yeah.
And inadvertently gossip about them or talk about them or whatever, and don't present them as being as honorable
Yeah.
as we are.
Sure.
And or join in a conversation with others that's going on where we participate and minimize others.
Yeah.
To our increase.
It's good.
But we claim to be.
But claim to be. Yeah. I think that the hypocrisy theme here is what's important. Are there some ways in which, because that's what's, Judas is doing that here. He's being highly hypocritical, inconsistent whenever he, before everybody, in front of everybody, not just the people he's brought with him, the soldiers and so forth, but the disciples, he's willing to do this pretty ostentatious display of affection. It's
But we have to know and own that we can be like Judas.
yeah.
And we need to own that we could fall like Peter. We have to, or this text does us no good.
So we have to admit that there's something operating within each of us. There are moments where we want to be recognized and we want to be seen as good and we want to be seen as great Christians aligning with Jesus and all that. So we will say great things and we will pledge great things. But then in the day-to-day, am I willing to give a cup of cold water? Am I willing to fill that person's gas tank? Am I willing, to hand that person some food? Am I willing to put down my own pride and emotions and feelings and say it's better for that person to feel better in that moment than it is for me to feel good? It's hard for me to nail down some exact things without getting very, very personal. But it's tough when someone and I think maybe the key here is to try to put ourselves in the place of Jesus, not in authority, but in suffering in this moment. Because we probably all kind of been there. Have you had somebody who betrayed you in something like this way, where ostensibly they were on your side and they said that they were and they showed you that they were in many, many different ways, and then when that opportunity came, the rug pulled out from underneath you in very painful ways.
That's what Paul said. He said he bore the Messiah's marks on his body.
Yeah,
So I think that's what we're called to do.
that's what we're called to do.
And going back to Matthew 25, we show our love to Christ by showing our love
To others. Yeah.
particularly, as Elizabeth Johnson says, particularly to the people of faith.
Yeah.
That's how we show our love to Christ, by showing our love to each other.
Yeah. So it's tough when someone does that. Can I forbear in those kinds of situations? Okay. Especially when Judas was so mistaken, in what was valuable here, and you see that in the consequences of his actions. He must not have thought that Jesus would be condemned, and that prompted him to be so guilty, to put this money ahead of a person, and to become so very guilty to the point where that drives him to kill himself. So there's a mistaken value to our service, I think, sometimes when we do that. But anyway, he becomes just overwhelmed with his emotions and his reactions. He reacted to his sin in the wrong way. And we've talked about this a few times, that he could have, even after betraying him, come back to Jesus. But really, he doesn't give himself the opportunity, doesn't give himself the chance. Because once he feels the guilt, it overwhelms him to a point where he goes and takes care of this right away. And so by the time Jesus is raised from the dead, Judas is not around. So it's tough. I get a little emotional about this. I'm sorry.
Life is messy.
Yeah, yeah. What?
Well, it makes me think that he had the idea that Jesus would fight back.
Sure.
Because the scripture says when he saw that he was condemned, he tried to give the money back.
Right.
first of all.
Yeah, Matthew
And
27.
when he gave it back, this is blood money, and I think he came to the realization, yes, it certainly is blood money, and he did what he did.
Yeah, so, it's hard to know exactly what Judas thought would happen. I don't think Judas thought this would happen, exactly this. He was hoping for something that would spur Jesus on to a greater superhero-like action. Sandy?
I think it just shows how much he did not trust Jesus.
Yeah, show and the disciples, when Jesus is not around and people come to the disciples and they're looking for Jesus and they've got questions for Jesus or they've got concerns, you can see the conflict in each of the disciples' faces when they're like, oh goodness, I don't actually know the answer to this and I don't know what to do. And Jesus isn't here, and so they're all very tempted to just kind of go with what they think would be right. And so it's always a test of faith. It's a test of trust for them. Should I actually just go find Jesus, or should I actually wait until Jesus comes back to give this person the answer that they really need? And so it is. It is a test of faith and trust. And so Judas, you're right, Judas doesn't have that level of trust in Jesus, and that's part of why he takes matters into his own hands. That's a little bit of what I had in mind earlier with the ways that we can betray Jesus. Sometimes we just kind of take matters into our own hands, and we try to fix things on our own. We try to step in to situations we shouldn't step into when God is already doing work behind the scenes, and it's hard to see.
Hagar, the story of
Yeah.
Hagar.
Yeah.
That was not the plan.
It-
We try to make this plan our plan.
Yeah, that never should have been, right? It really, ideally, never should have been to bring her into the situation and abuse her and all that. That never should have happened. And yet, of course, God takes that and makes something amazing of it. He uses it.
Those of us who are impatient struggle with this even more. So maybe Judas was impatient and wanted to see this
Yeah,
done.
get it done.
And so in my life, it is very hard for me to be still
And no.
know that I'm God, because I want to fix things quickly. And so maybe I am like Sarah, and I want to bring Hagar. But you know what I'm saying is I want to jump in and have a better idea than God does.
Yeah. And we don't have a better idea. Along the lines of the guilt, I wanted to bring up again 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and Paul's statement about sorrow, godly sorrow. The sorrow of the world produces death. Godly sorrow produces what? Repentance. And so very literally that's what happens here with Judas. And so the first sorrow, the sorrow that brings death, is a sorrow that is very self-preoccupied. I am sad because I got caught. I'm sad because it brings a light onto me that does not show favorably. I'm worried about how it looks on me. My pride has been broken. People will know how vulnerable I am. All those kinds of thoughts are the more sorrowful because of me, whereas the sorrow, the godly sorrow, seems to be so much more preoccupied or focused on, I sinned against God, as the prodigal's change was. I sinned against God. And that's what brought the change in him, right? I sinned against God, not just, oh no, I messed up my life. Here I am in the pig pen. That's sad, but I'm really sad that I sinned against God. So that seems to be what's kind of missing in Judas's situation, that is very, very present in Peter, obviously, as we'll see later in this chapter. Well, we won't see it in this chapter, but we'll see how Peter reacts later. And then Paul, again, you think about Paul and his past service and the level of guilt he must have felt once he realized what was actually happening. And yet, he does things like in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 9 and 10, where he is so focused on God's grace and God's willingness to give him a second chance. And he sees